Take the shot. How far would you go? Jonathan. Farley's underground bunker was a well-kept secret, one that the mayor took pains to keep that way. No one needed to know the extent of his wealth or his resources. During the past 2 winters especially. He had said nothing, not a word about it to anyone, since the Western Front had overrun the town, looting, snatching people up to join their ranks, and burning half of the damn town to the ground in the process. After that, food had been scarce, and he had even considered, if only in passing, limiting his intake of the food stores he had collected, in order so as to not bring attention to his door. He had thought of it, sure, but continued to avail himself of the fine foods, the rare liquor, while others in town starved. The fact was, he didn't give a damn what the other people in this town had to go through. It was their fault, for being the mindless sheep that they were, and this was the natural order of things. The only exclusion to this was his son, and sometimes Jonathan Farley wondered if he had made a mistake allowing James to know as much as he did. The boy was hot-headed, impetuous, and worse, loose-lipped, with a few drinks in him. Farley shook his head and swished the glass of port in his hand gently. It was chilled, thanks to the reusable ice cubes he had plucked from their bin in the freezer. Here in his hideout, his secret lair at the end of a 50-foot-long tunnel, dug 15 feet deep in the earth, the only access to it a rusty hatch hidden behind the hay bales in the barn, he could relax. Not even James bothered him here. Well, not usually. Really only at Farley's behest. Tonight, or in the morning, he would be coming by to report on how the transaction had gone. James had never shown a preference for port, or any of the near-priceless bottles of wine Farley had trucked in here, 1 case at a time, and he hadn't told his son about the rest of the liquor, the higher-end stuff that he didn't feel he needed to share. He had made sure to throw everyone off the scent by installing a significant number of items that he could use as a trade. The rest, everything stored here in his hidey-hole, well, that was for his personal use. In the depths of the earth, it took some juice to keep the coolers full of meat, seafood, and more running, but not nearly as much as it would have on the surface, where it could exceed 100 degrees in the summer. The humidity often brought it to a heat index of 103 degrees, and despite the chilly temperatures now in play, Farley could still remember how the sweat caused his clothing to cling to his body. He shivered at the thought, in the cool of the wine room. It was late November, and the winter had long since descended, capturing the Midwestern states in its icy grip. There was one oversized chair of tufted leather and a high back in the middle of a room, surrounded by wine racks, the outer circle of which held the freezers full of goods against the outer stone walls. This deep underground, with nothing but stone surrounding him, and it was a constant 55 degrees. The only thing that varied was the humidity level. The port was sweet and heavy on his tongue. Since the collapse, Jonathan Farley had placed his fingers in even more pies than he had already had them in as the bank president and town alderman. The town was lucky to have him, though he was sure that the sheeple wouldn't see it that way. His wheeling and dealing had helped ensure that no one else invaded, and that was important, because the town of Belton, a mere 26,000 souls before the collapse and invasion of Western Front troops, was now down to a fraction of its size. And it wasn't as if the land surrounding them was empty or devoid of life. Before the collapse, there had been more than 2 million people in the greater Kansas City area. 2 million. And while many had fled or died in the fighting or of starvation and disease, there were plenty left. It was enough to warrant more than just a town militia to defend their borders. It meant deals, brokered arrangements, and shady compromises. Belton had always been a rather white town, but before the collapse, you could still see diversity, however limited. It was that small amount of color difference that had been the first to fall. When the chief of police, James Wingo, had sensed a change in the wind, one that would eventually carry the Western Front to their door, he had sat Farley down and had some strong suggestions for how the future of their vulnerable town could be secured with a few changes. Those few changes had included dozens of well-placed evictions. That several of the evicted had the temerity to suggest that Belton, Missouri, had become a sundown town was met with ridicule, even if it was accurate. Shutting down that talk had led to what seemed inevitable, a slippery slope into what some might even call human trafficking. He preferred to think of it as improving their community, with a side benefit of getting some folks a future they were far better fitted for. Farley sniffed and took a large gulp of port, then nibbled on a rich brownie that Sarah Turner had baked with the last of the chocolate. At least, it was the last of the chocolate that she had. He had at least 30 pounds of it in a box down the hall. His thoughts briefly strayed to exactly how he was going to find some more chocolate, and better yet, not have it shared with the others in town. Sarah wasn't a native to Belton, but his control over her and what she was able to do at her small cafe on Main Street had slipped slightly as the years wore on. He grimaced and swallowed more port. She was rather popular now, no doubt thanks to her mad baking skills. Those who hadn't learned how to go back to basics and bake their own bread often brought their rations to her, and she managed to make the magic happen. The fact that she didn't ask anything in payment for the work also worked in her favor. It was hard to argue with people's stomachs, and it had led to her and her 2 children being welcomed into the fold by most. The trade in people, more specifically those less fortunate, or those who were not raised as well as they should have been, had been an unfortunate yet necessary course of action. His town, as Farley liked to consider it, needed the best. People who would work hard and follow his directives. Those who couldn't, or who asked too many annoying questions, well, they needed to move on, disappear even, so long as they stopped interfering with Farley running the town in the manner in which it needed to be run. People disappeared all the time these days, after all. Wingo had already taken the lead on handling the drug production and trade in the area, something that kept those undesirables left who still had some use, quiet and compliant. But he had tasked Farley with making sure that a steady trickle of people, unwanted or non-compliant, were provided to the surrounding areas in exchange for protection from invasion. What they did with the unwanted, well, that wasn't his business, was it? The collapse had changed everything but human nature. There would always be the haves and the have-nots, and Farley was determined to fall into the latter category. As the bombs had fallen, and the world at large had descended into chaos, losing the electrical grid and communications array had sent their once proud nation back to the Dark Ages. And here, in what Farley thought of as the unlikeliest of places, they had found some kind of balance in what could only be described as a form of city-state. The remnants of the political structure had shifted and morphed into a mix of get whatever you can and hold on to it, and a territorial shifting of priorities, one that recreated the warring city-states of ancient times. What most of the citizens of Belton didn't know or understand was that the currency had changed. They no longer operated in a fiat currency. Instead, it was trade. And while food crops, even cattle, were highly prized, the trade he personally specialized in was not trade that most people accepted. In the new post-collapse world, food, drugs, and human beings were the new currency, and Farley and Wingo, working together, controlled them all. James was heading up the collection of a woman who would provide a tidy solution to an imminent problem. An addict with loose lips and one-time worker for Wingo, she had become a problem that needed solving. He had told his son to check in with him once the deed was done. Farley gathered the last rich crumbs of brownie goodness from his plate and drained the last drops of port from his glass. He didn't let morality interfere with his life. That was something Evelyn would have done. His late wife had been the religious one, the moral one. At least she had been until the cancer began to eat away at her brain. It had turned her into a hate-spewing, paranoid creature. Their son James had been young, 10 maybe, when the delusions had really set in. Farley had her put in an institution immediately. That kind of behavior, created by illness or not, simply had no place in his orderly existence. It had been a short stay. The cancer, while relentless, had been mercifully quick, just 6 months from diagnosis to death, and Farley had found himself raising the boy all on his own. For a child he hadn't particularly wanted, it had been an onerous burden. Figure in the collapse a handful of years later, and it was almost too much to bear. He'd increased the enormous life insurance payout in a number of financial wheelings and dealings, which had quickly tripled the amount he had been paid. He then engaged in an out-of-state contractor to dig the tunnels and lay in the solar when the rumors of a financial collapse began to circulate. While most of the nation was focused on elections or Black Lives Matter, the latest epidemic or rising food costs, Jonathan Farley was stocking foods, supplies, weapons, and any other creature comforts he could think of. Let the world burn. He was ready for it. The Western Front blowing through had both helped and hindered his position. He had been lucky that he had the sniffles that day and not gone into work. He had been an alderman with dreams of more power, but with several seasoned candidates in his way. Almost to a man, they had died during the invasion. The one who had been left, the lone female alderman with plenty of clout and her fingers in every pie, had been spared, only to lose her husband and grown son in the attack. Marjorie Brown hadn't lasted long. The first round of a bad flu had taken her that first year, and the path to the mayorship had been cleared for him. In that sense, he certainly had the Western Front to thank, but the damage they had done had been substantial. By the time the fires had been put out and the dead and missing accounted for, Belton had less than 1/10 of its population left.
Town of more than 20,000 people, to one that hovered in the range of around 1,800.
Farley shook his head at the thought. His father, had he still been alive, would likely have been sorely disappointed in him. The old man had aspired to far more, and he had dabbled in politics as well, while making his fortune in several investment firms that were nothing better than Ponzi schemes. But power was power. If the town had still had its population intact, it would have been far more difficult to control. Farley knew this for a fact. He wasn't a pie-in-the-sky dreamer, and he understood people rather well. He knew himself better than most, and he could see that others respected him only for the power he wielded, not for his sparkling personality. He was good at making money, better at keeping it, and he made sure to keep his supporters well plied with the occasional rare gift. Farley was as happy as could be expected in these trying times, and if he positioned himself right, he would continue to profit and grow, come what may. That was the goal, at least. And the challenge of profit through cold, hard cash, or the wealth of choice when others had little of either, that was one he embraced. He poured more of the port and picked up a remote, aiming it at the enormous speakers on one wall. A moment later, Vivaldi blossomed forth. Farley smiled and settled back to wait for his son. A warm glow was beginning to spread through Farley's limbs when a chirp of alarm sounded. "Front hatch, open," chimed his security alarm. It was disabled. He had been expecting his son, but not for a few more hours. He was handling a transfer tonight. The girl was a particularly troublesome one, and Farley had certainly been happy to assist Wingo when she didn't make good on payment for services rendered. The girl had made certain promises in return for a hefty amount of meth, and she hadn't kept her end of the bargain. As far as Farley was concerned, the ones who couldn't afford their addictions tended to be the worst of the riffraff, causing troubles in other areas, theft, disruptive behavior, and more. The fact that she had been one of the former alderman's kids made it all the sweeter. He would be all too happy to hand her over to the gentlemen's club that had been restarted some 40 miles outside of Kansas City on I-70. His connection there had made sure to take care of his son James' needs as well. But Farley had little time or inclination for such cheap things. In truth, he had hoped for a little more with Sarah Turner, even though he could see she had no interest.
"Better that I live a simple life, monastic in nature,"
he mused, as he slipped the last crumbs into his mouth and followed it with the last mouthful of port. He stood up and turned to greet his son as he emerged from the long tunnel. James looked worse for wear, and that was being kind. His nose, chin, and the front of his shirt were a bloody mess. His eyes were wild with panic. Jonathan felt a rush of fear flow through him.
"What happened?"
he barked at James.
"We have a situation, sir."
His boy looked afraid, but at least he kept up decorum. Long ago, likely long before the boy's mother's cancer had eaten her brain, Farley had insisted the boy call him sir, just as his own father had done. It was the small yet meaningful traditions like that which kept them above the simpler folk. Farley set his glass down and wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin. He kept his composure, but he hated the sight of blood, and James' face was covered in it.
Go on. The crazy bitch got a drop on me. Damn near broke my nose and hit me on the head with something. By the time I came to, she was gone.
Farley stared at his son incredulously.
Why are you here? Get Wingo and a couple of men you can trust and go after her. I just thought... No, you didn't think. If you had been thinking, we wouldn't be having this discussion, would we? Get Wingo, get Peyton and Trey, and get her back, now, before she flaps her mouth to anyone in town.
The chances that anyone would believe C.C. Baker, an addict and compulsive liar, were small, but if they got wind that James Farley, the son of the mayor, was involved, well, things could get sticky. Farley shook his head.
Stupid boy. Should have known better than to expect him to do this job right.
He dusted a few crumbs off of his shirt and barked at his son.
Go on. Round her up, and I'll get Wingo to pitch in. She isn't going far. Stupid girl has alienated anyone willing to help her a long time back.
And if she got out, if she talked to anyone, it could mean real trouble for all of them. Until the girl had shown what a real mess she was, they had used her for production and distribution. It had only been recently that she had shown herself to be unreliable.
Why didn't I push for her to be removed last week? Hell, I could have had Wingo give her too big a dose and just had her OD. Too late for that now, though.
He felt anxiety ratchet up his pulse. Best they caught her quick. There was talk on the wind of a reformation, and there hadn't been any fighting for quite a while. The time for these murky transactions was coming to a close, and that little skank, Cece, had been involved in far too many of them. She wasn't particularly smart, but now that she knew James was involved, it didn't take much for anyone of any basic intelligence to look farther past the boy to the real source. And Farley couldn't have that. In a few years, the world would reset itself, climb out of the darkness, and society would go back to what it had been before the dollar had collapsed and the bombs had fallen. Life was cyclic like that. The bad times didn't last, but neither did the good. Existence between birth and death was far messier than most would care to recognize.
Find her, and I'll meet you at the rendezvous, north of town,
Farley barked at his son. James, who had been gingerly wiping at the caked blood from his face, nodded, his shoulders hunched, and disappeared down the tunnel without another word. Jeremiah Flanagan woke from a doze, the ground hard and cold beneath him. Danny, her tiny body spooned against the inside of his, slept hard, a bundle of warmth tucked in tight. He did his best not to wake her. She was exhausted, dark rings under her eyes from lack of food and the endless walking. She hadn't said much, not since they had left New Mexico behind, some 4 weeks ago. He slid one leg out of the thick, extra-large sleeping bag, and then the other, easing out of it, wincing at the cold air which sucked his energy away. His stomach grumbled, and he knew they would need to find a town soon, one that might take them in, if only for a day or two, one that would have work for him to do, so they could restock on supplies before hitting the road again. He'd been a fool to try to do this now, in winter, but really, what choice did he have? Danny shifted as a gust of cold air invaded the sleeping bag in his absence. She didn't wake, however, and Jeremiah slipped on his gloves before he tried to stoke the campfire back to life. He winced at how stiff they felt, the cold affecting him in a way that he had never experienced until now. New Mexico got cold, sure, but this was bone-aching cold. It slipped in and surrounded you, enough to make you wonder if you would ever be warm again. And it would only get worse, especially when he thought of where they were heading. Canada in winter. He shook his head.
What kind of fool heads north, on foot, with a preschooler in winter?
It hadn't been cold when he left. Not at all. The weather had been warm, short-sleeve weather, as Shannon had called it, and consumed with grief and loneliness in the wake of her passing, it had seemed like the right thing to do. His mother's older brother, his Uncle Jamie, had settled outside of Winnipeg not long before the collapse. His last emails, before the power had failed and the nuke hit Austin, causing a string of chaotic events, had been to invite Jeremiah and Shannon there to his farm, an extensive parcel that was self-sufficient and safe. But Shannon hadn't wanted to leave. New Mexico had been home to the De Silva clan for generations, and she had never so much as stepped foot outside of the state in her entire life. Neither had Danny, for that matter. Shannon had given birth to their daughter nearly 5 years after the collapse, surrounded by her mother and sister and a cousin who had been a doula since before Shannon was born. Jeremiah poked the fire, pushing aside the layer of white to reveal the glowing red embers beneath. He added a piece of old, weathered fencing, all that he was able to gather the evening before, and tossed a handful of dead grass on it. The glow intensified, smoke curling, a crackle and spit, before the flame jumped to life, heat emanating from it, which felt good on his chilled face, but also pulled the already dry skin tighter until it felt as if he were wearing a tight mask. He added another piece of fencing and watched the flames lick up the worm-riddled wood. Danny stirred then, stretching at his feet. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment before she burrowed deeper, out of sight, in the folds of the sleeping bag. Her red hair was a mass of tangles. He'd forgotten a brush, and it had descended into a matted mess of snarls.
I suck at this, Shannon. God knows I do.
He watched the flames grow, hypnotized and lost in thought. Those last moments with Shannon, watching the fever take her in its clutches and not let go. It's dysentery. I'm sure of it. The Lakewoods down the way had it, and it presented just like this, Shannon's mom had said at the end of August, shutting the enormous tome she regularly consulted in times of illness. The Lakewood family had all died within days of each other as they ran high fevers and vomited and shit themselves. It had been sudden and fatal. But the antibiotics were gone, long gone, and although there had been rumors of the Reformation, it certainly hadn't made it to their little hamlet of Hatch, New Mexico. Jeremiah closed his eyes, turned, and let the heat of the flames warm his back. Rosalia de Silva had survived the dysentery that gripped her and her daughters. It had left her a weakened wreck, however, especially after Shannon and Sonora had both died. He stared at Danny's small shape, now completely hidden within the sleeping bag. Her chest rose and fell rhythmically. Rosalia had been a formidable woman when Shannon had brought him home to meet her, and it was only her own bout with the disease and the loss of her daughters that had robbed her of the strength to fight his departure. The heat pulsed into his back, the fire crackling merrily now, spitting sparks, the ancient wood engulfed in flames. His stomach grumbled, and he reluctantly left the warmth of the fire to dig through the backpack for the last cans of food they had. Danny roused from the sleeping bag, her tiny fists rubbing at her eyes.
Hey, Sugar Plum,
she mumbled, "Hi, Da," and pulled the sleeping bag close to her, a tiny shiver racking her body.
We've got corned beef hash and peaches for breakfast.
Jeremiah watched as her lower lip began to tremble. She said nothing, but tears filled her green eyes.
It's all we have, kiddo, at least until we get to the next town.
He reached out and plucked a crumpled leaf out of her rat's nest of tangles, paused, and remembered how his wife had been with her. He leaned down, cupped her tiny chin in his hand, and kissed her forehead just as he had seen Shannon do 1,000 times.
Did you sleep okay?
He asked, reaching for the cans of food. Nights were the worst for her. There hadn't been one night without tears, not one. Danny nodded, but said nothing more. He felt his chest tighten. His baby girl missed her mom. Hell, he missed Shannon so badly it felt as if his heart had shriveled up and died with her. But for Danny, who had been Shannon's shadow since the day she could walk, the loss of her mother had been the most traumatizing event of her life, seconded only by leaving the only home she had ever known.
You goddamn fool. You should have stayed in New Mexico.
Was it a fool's errand, this quest to find Uncle Jamie's farm?
Most likely we'll both die out here. At best you don't, and you actually find this damn farm, only to learn he's moved on or died or the place is burned to the ground.
At first they had ridden a sweet 3-wheeled bicycle he had bought shortly before everything went to hell. But after a couple of close calls on I-35, the third time of which had seen them running for cover as troops moved through, Jeremiah had had more than enough. Which faction of troops they were, he had no idea, and he wasn't willing to find out. He had ditched the bike, and they had hidden within the forest, moving deeper as he watched several of the soldiers stop at the bike and then look toward the line of forest. He hadn't wanted to know whether they would take what little the father-daughter duo had or simply shoot them. Later, as dusk stole over the land, he had snuck back close enough to see that the bike was gone, no doubt taken by the soldiers. That was okay. 2 of the 3 tires had already begun to leak, and without a spare, he was on borrowed time with it anyway. They had stuck to smaller roads and occasionally cut through forests or wide grassland. It was better to avoid the towns when possible, and the terrain had been slow going, but they hadn't managed to get as far on foot as he had hoped. His back, neck, and arms ached from carrying her on his shoulders, and Danny's shoes were sporting cracks in the soles, and the thin canvas wasn't enough to keep her feet warm as she stumbled along the ground beside him. Something had to give. They still had at least 800 miles to go, and winter was here. Jeremiah struggled to remember how in the hell he had thought it would take a month, maybe 2 at most, to travel over 1,600 miles with a 3-year-old. The math had seemed simpler somehow when he was imagining them riding the bike, Danny perched on the custom seat he had built in the back, the wind blowing in her hair. On foot, however, reality had set in. Still, he could have turned back. He had been closer to Hatch, easier to return, admit defeat. It was his Irish blood. That's what Shannon would have told him, laughing, as she threaded her long, delicate fingers through his red hair or spread aloe vera over his ever-present sunburn. Shannon, with her dark brown curls, olive skin, and hazel eyes. God, he missed her. The dysentery had taken her so fast, faster than any of them could have been ready for. In his darkest moments, he had hated her for leaving him, for leaving Danny, who hadn't smiled once, not once, in the 8 weeks and 5 days since they had lost her. Shannon had been the glue that kept them together, the one who had stood up to her mother and insisted that Jeremiah was her choice and her love, defiant in the face of maternal disapproval. Without Shannon, he had no chance of withstanding the hurricane that was Rosalia de Silva. Jeremiah slipped off a glove and hooked the pull tabs on both cans of food with his fingers, gently easing them back one at a time. He couldn't afford an injury or cut. Not now. Not on the road. A week earlier, he had stepped wrong. 1 minute he'd been fine, the next he had been on his knees. It had hurt for days and slowed them down. The ground was uneven here, whether it was forest or open prairie, and occasionally, after examining their surroundings well in both directions, he would slip onto a gravel road, grateful for a more even-footed stretch to walk on. Still, it wasn't a good idea. He'd seen what some of the troops that barreled through these main roads had done. Whatever side they were on, it wasn't that of anyone unfortunate enough to run into them. There had been one hair-raising encounter at least 2 weeks past, with 3 men dressed in fatigues, all armed. Jeremiah had been lost in thought, and Danny had been draped over his shoulders, a slick of drool escaping from her mouth, dozing as he walked. He'd been so busy picking his way through the forest he had walked into their encampment before he had even realized they were there. The dark muzzle of a shotgun in his face had nearly caused his bowels to loosen, but it had been the larger of the 3 men, sitting on a fallen tree next to their campfire, and the lascivious look that he had fixed on Danny that had turned Jeremiah's blood ice cold. It had all happened so quick, but the man holding the shotgun had waved Jeremiah away when he learned he wasn't a local. As he had put tracks between them, picking up his pace to a jog shortly after their camp disappeared in the trees behind him, he had wondered if they really were soldiers. There had been plenty of talk, rumor really, of what was happening in the country. After the reports of nukes, a wave of silence had hit. It had left them to wonder, and fear, about what was really happening. Rumors had flown thick, especially from anyone who dared to travel. Several factions of soldiers were fighting for control of what remained of the United States.
Although really, what is left, after all?
Jeremiah had wondered more than once.
D.C. is a nuclear wasteland. So is Austin.
Nevertheless, the various factions found something to fight about. Considering how dirty the 3 soldiers had been, Jeremiah couldn't help wondering 2 things. Was there anything worth fighting over? And were the men deserters of whatever faction they had originally sworn allegiance to? Danny's small hand on his arm brought him back to present. She handed him the can of corned beef hash. There was more than half left.
Sugar plum, you gotta eat your share. Here, take one more bite.
His daughter made a face, but opened her mouth obediently to the spoon he held out to her. He looked at the can of peaches, untouched in his hand, and speared several slices with his fork.
And I need to take my own advice, don't I now?
He shoved the sweet, dripping mess into his mouth, wiped the drop of juice that escaped down his chin, and handed the can to his daughter. They would need to find food soon. Danny was looking peaked, tiring earlier, and stumbling along the way as they walked, and he wasn't faring much better. Walking took a lot of calories out of them, more than they were taking in, and that was for sure. Especially now that the weather was colder. Perhaps he could find a way to pay their way to overwinter in the next town. "Da, carry me?" His heart wrenched at her request. He was tired, exhausted even after a night's sleep, and he forced a smile on his face.
Sure, sweetheart. Just for a little while, though, okay?
He could manage a short distance, maybe the first mile or 2 even. She sat and watched him as he broke down their camp, rolling their sleeping bag up and zipping everything away neatly before he lifted her onto his shoulders. She felt lighter as he lifted her, but as soon as she was settled on his shoulders, he regretted agreeing to carry her. Her little butt was bony and dug into his shoulder blades. She had lost weight over the long journey, of that he was certain, but so had he, and it was hard enough carrying all of their equipment. He teetered off balance for a mere moment, and she clutched at his hair in fear.
Easy there, Sugar Plum. I need that hair to keep my head warm,
Jeremiah said, wincing as she clawed for safe purchase. The sooner they got to the small town of Belton, the better. He grimaced, hoping that Danny's elfin face turned their war-weary hearts into puddles of kindness. If it didn't, they had a day, maybe 3 at the outset, before either of them would simply stop being able to travel at all. It was simply bad luck what happened next. If Jeremiah had known whose field he was stepping into, if the sign that read, "Keep Out," hadn't been felled by a recent storm, and if a particular, highly private trade between 2 parties who prized their anonymity above all else had not been happening at that very moment, Jeremiah and Danny's lives would likely have been very different. Danny had seen the sign. Her head, a good foot above Jeremiah's, had given her that extra range needed. It was on its side, wrenched from its hole and turned away by the tree that had felled the section of fencing they were now walking through. She recognized the letters, at least some of them. Her mother had been teaching her letters earlier in the spring, tracing the shape of them in the dirt outside of their house. Danny could see a K, which was a letter she loved. K is for kitten. Danny could still hear her mommy's voice in her head, see the stick in her mind as it scratched through the dust, making shapes. Danny had been trying to find out where Mama Cat had hidden her new kittens for days and days, likely under the front porch, which was off limits due to fears of snakes or scorpions. She had wanted a kitten more than anything, and the K, well, it looked perfect, a shape that promised happiness. Just a moment to glance at the sign, though, before Da moved on into the small clearing surrounded by trees. The K had been followed by 2 E's and a P. Da? What's K and E and E and P? She asked. Jeremiah lurched to one side beneath her as he stepped over the uneven terrain.
K, E, E, P, Sugar Plum?
He lurched again, swearing under his breath.
That spells keep.
Danny nodded and said nothing more. She hadn't read the bottom half of the sign. There hadn't been time, after all. The small clearing was not empty. There was a series of low-slung buildings in various stages of disrepair. No wood smoke, though, so likely they were abandoned. It was too cold out for there to not be wood smoke, and both of them started with surprise at the sound of voices coming from the boarded-up house to the left. It was 2 men, at least, and their voices sounded angry. A second later, and a woman's voice. The words were not clear, but the woman sounded scared. Jeremiah stopped in his tracks and gently slid Danny off of his shoulders, bringing his face down close to hers, a finger to his lips. Danny. Da? Danny began to speak, and Jeremiah hushed her. The look on his face was clear. He was afraid. Before Mama had died, he had only looked like that once, when Tuna, Grammy's dog, had gotten bitten by a rattlesnake by the back shed where Danny liked to play. Tuna's leg had swollen up, impossibly big, and he had died. Da had grabbed her arm and told her not to go anywhere near the back shed. The next time he had looked like that, Mama had died. And the time after that, it had been when the soldiers took their bike. Da didn't get scared very often, but if he was afraid right now, so should she be. Danny clamped her mouth shut, eyes widening, and took his hand, sticking close to his left hip. The voices were louder now, clear, despite there being boards over the windows and the others being inside while they crept by. There was a small creek in the distance, along with another thatch of trees. Da pointed to them, making sure she understood. That's where they needed to go. That's what would get them away from this place and the angry voices. "You can't treat me like this. I kept my mouth shut, never said nothing to no one." That was a woman talking.
"She knows too much, Farley. We can't trade her to the whorehouse. She'll open her goddamn mouth, and now, thanks to Jimmy screwing this up, she knows you were in it too."
The voice was low, closer, and Danny realized with a start that the two men were standing outside of the ramshackle house, in clear view. They hadn't noticed Danny or Da, but they would at any moment. The taller one, the one who had been speaking, left the shorter, fat man standing there and walked inside.
"Oh, shit!"
shouted another younger man's voice inside, and an aborted scream from the woman as a shot rang out. A loud thump followed. Danny had tried to be silent, but even she knew something bad had happened. A sharp gasp from her, and the fat man's eyes shifted, suddenly seeing the father and daughter there, and he jumped a little in surprise. Da said nothing. Nothing at all, as he grabbed Danny's hand in a brutal grip and began to run through the tall, dead prairie grass. Danny could feel her feet flying, the grass whipping against her feet, not even touching the hard, cold ground. If she could have looked behind her, she would have seen the fat man turn back to the house, wave at his partner to come back out, and the man give chase. Instead, she simply held on to Da's coat as they flew, everything a blur of browns and yellows and golds, mixed with snow and eventually ice-cold water as they entered the stream and then the trees and did not stop. It felt like an eternity. Eventually, Danny could hear Da's breaths coming in rasps, huge heaving gasps of air as he continued to run. The trees that had closed around them had twisted and turned with the stream, lining it, providing cover, but also a challenge of twists and turns. They rose and lowered on each side of the stream, the terrain far from even. The man shouted at them to stop, but Da didn't listen. He kept running. And with him, Danny simply held on. She felt like she was flying. It might even have been enjoyable in any other circumstances, but this was all too fast and scary.
"Someday, Sugarplum, I'm going to take you on a roller coaster,"
Da had told her.
"They're all closed right now. Soon the world will turn right again, and I'll take you on a roller coaster, and you'll scream and be scared and love it, all at the same time."
Da had traveled all over the world. He'd been born in a place really far away called Ireland.
"Across the pond,"
he'd said, but a bigger one than they had near the farm. A super big one that was deeper than anything she'd ever seen. Da had told her about coming to the United States, traveling all over, and that his car had broken down in a tiny town in New Mexico. And
"I fell in love with your mama, Sugarplum, and suddenly traveling the world didn't seem half as important as staying right here and being with her."
Da's red hair and bright green eyes were an oddity there in their small hometown. But his voice, it was his voice that always drew the stares. Danny loved it more than anything. As he ran, slower now, his breaths coming ragged and harsh, the trees thinned out onto a large open patch. Nearby was a continuing line of forest and trees. It had diverged from the stream, charting its own path. In the far distance, she could see the tops of what looked like houses, a town possibly, It was then that the shot rang out, and Da jerked and fell into the stream. They had come so far. Danny couldn't even see the ramshackle house, or even the men that had been chasing her, but Da lay in the water, and Danny, flung in a sprawling heap at the side of the stream, stared at Da, waiting for him to get up. Her backpack had ripped as they fell, and it cushioned her fall, only a small tear in the knee of her jeans, and a pinprick of pain to show for such a heavy, abrupt fall. Looking at him, he didn't seem hurt. There was a tiny rip or hole in the back of his jacket, but nothing else. She pulled on his arm, and he moaned. That was when she saw the water moving away, sluggishly, and colored a dark crimson red. Danny couldn't make words come out of her mouth. A whine of fear escaped, similar to the one that caught the fat man's attention back at the clearing, but nothing else. Da shifted, groaned, and blinked. His mouth was bloody. Danny could see it now that he lifted his head, barely moving, just lying there in the icy water. His lips moved, and she knelt down in the stream, ignoring the ice-cold water, trying to hear what he was saying. It wasn't louder than a whisper. Closer, closer.
Run, Danny. Run away.
The words were Da's, but they were so quiet, so low, it felt like a nightmare where nothing sounds or works right. Danny shook with fear, her teeth chattering with her feet and knees soaked in the ice-cold shallow water. Da raised his head again and choked, blood speckling the smooth rock in the stream next to his head.
Go!
And somehow she had. She picked herself up, focused on the nearby forest, and ran. As she did, she could hear men's voices. Mainly they shouted at each other, but once or twice they shouted at her to stop. She didn't listen. Da had told her to run, and run she would. As she entered the trees, a second shot rang out. Danny didn't stop, however. She just kept on running until she tripped, her small body catapulting over a half-buried tree branch and then sliding to a stop in a culvert filled with brush and leaves. It hurt. Vegetation scraped her face and hands, and she winced as she tried to tuck the injured hands into her pockets. The culvert that she had landed in was rather deep on the side she had fallen in on. To one side was an enormous dead tree protruding on the edge of rocks, and a dark crevice of dirt and leaves provided a nest of sorts. She crept into it, pulling the leaves up and around her, like Da had taught her the other day.
Sugarplum, if you ever get too cold out here, and for some reason you are all on your own, just make a little hole and pull the leaves and dry vegetation up all around you. It'll help warm you.
She could hear his voice in her head, warm and rich. A tear slipped down her cheek, then another and another. It mingled with the dirt, fat drips falling muddy onto her hands. The men were coming. She could hear them now.
A little kid, by the looks of it. She couldn't have gone far.
The older man's voice rang out dangerously close, and Danny tried to hold her breath. She flattened against the earth and rocks, her body disappearing from view, the leaves thick and comforting, a great thick blanket of them. She tried to hold still, though, for fear that the very things keeping her safe and helping to warm her would be the same things that gave her away. She listened as the man's footsteps came closer. A younger man's voice, his breathing labored, spoke up.
She's just a little kid. What's she gonna do, really, Chief?
She could point. Tell someone we shot her daddy,
the older man, Chief, responded. Another body came in, his breath rattling as he wheezed to a stop.
Christ, Wingo, why the hell did you do that? You shot that man. There's no covering that shit up. Cece, back at the farm, that was justified. But I could have talked to the guy, sent him and the kid on their way or something.
Danny couldn't be sure, but she thought it might be the fat man that had been back at the ramshackle house that was talking, well, wheezing. 3 men. The older one that had been outside with the fat man and was called Chief or Wingo, and the young man who had been inside the house. She wanted to make herself smaller, but she was afraid the leaves would make noise and give her away. They were close, so close.
Any sign of her?
Was all that the older man said in response, ignoring the other 2.
Not that I've seen.
How old do you think she is?
Wingo asked.
I couldn't tell you,
the fat man responded, still wheezing.
Small. Maybe
2 or 3 years old? Old enough to talk, then.
In the trees, a soft pattering began, and as Danny watched, ice particles began to fall, landing with an ever-increasing rapidity on the fallen leaves all around them.
The storm's rolling in,
Wingo said, his voice further away, back the way they all had come.
A kid that small will be dead by morning from exposure. And a problem.
Danny could hear him walking away, twigs snapping and the leaves crunching as he left.
I'll take care of the mess back at the house.
What about the guy in the creek?
The younger man called after him, still standing close to Danny's hiding spot.
Fuck him. He's no local. Folks won't give a damn about someone who got shot after he was creeping around fixing to rob 'em.
Wingo's words hung in the air, and then there was silence.
Damn, but this all went to shit.
The younger man whistled slowly.
You think?
The fat man spoke, his breathing mostly back to normal now, and he sounded angry.
You made a mess out of it. I should have never agreed to this human trafficking bullshit. Not with you making a hot mess of it from the get-go and shooting that man. Hell, Wingo's damn near lost his mind.
A branch snapped above Danny's head.
He's right about the kid, though. She's likely to die of exposure out here. So I'm thinking we might as well be on our way. I've had enough nasty business in the past hour to last a lifetime.
Danny could hear him slowly walking away, his departure noisy, his feet heavy on the forest floor.
You coming? We need to get that nose of yours looked at.
Yes, sir.
The crunch of leaves signaled his departure as well. Danny listened as the men left. Part of her was sure that they would be waiting, like the boogeyman from a nightmare, just out of range of hearing, waiting to grab her and hurt her like the chief Wingo man had wanted them to do. She took a chance, adjusted herself deeper into the drift of leaves, and closed her eyes. Just as quickly she opened them, looking at the empty woods. Around her, the storm began to pelt the forest with sleet. She would have to leave soon, likely go back to the stream where Da was. Da. I need Da. The leaves were warm, however, warmer than she had felt in a long time. Danny's eyes slid shut, and she sunk into a fragmented, restless doze. When Danny's eyes opened, the small amount of weak sunlight that had greeted her that morning on the road with Da was gone, replaced with gray. Sleet now fell solidly, a relatively loud, continuous sound. For a moment, Danny didn't remember where she was. It was a momentary confusion that had her back in New Mexico, staring at the alien forest around her. And then it all surfaced at once, the argument in the ramshackle house, the gunshot, their panicked run, and Da, falling in the stream bed. Her mouth formed his name, but her lips failed to speak it aloud. The leaves that covered her exploded out as she scrambled out of her hiding place, intent on getting back to the stream, back to Da. Her feet scrabbled up the embankment, up out of the culvert, slipping and sliding on the newly wet and slippery leaves. It was cold, ice cold now, but she didn't notice. All of her focus was on returning to Da, to the stream bed, to the only source of safety and comfort she had left since Mama had died, and Auntie Tia, too. She slipped and fell twice before emerging from the cover of the trees. As she ran out into the open, she could see his form, dark and alone, still sprawled in the stream bed. Some part of her gabbled in fear at the thought of the men that had chased her and Da. Could they still be here? But she kept focus on reaching Da. That was all that mattered. Her chest was heaving, her breaths sharp and ragged in the bitter cold as she slid to a stop next to him. She had seen Mama right after, before they had sealed her in the box and lowered her in the ground. Da, he looked like that, only covered in blood and his eyes open, not closed like Mama's had been. Still, she couldn't help but cling to him. She thought of a rhyme Mama would say at night, while they sat on the porch and looked up at the dark night sky and the panorama of stars. Mama had smiled and whispered, "Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish I may, I wish I might, have this wish I wish tonight." But there were no stars out. It was still day, although it was dark and gray and the sleet kept falling, a steady patter as it covered the browns and golds of the dead vegetation. And there were no wishes that could bring back the dead. How long she stayed there, Danny could not have known. Long enough that she felt cold all the way into her middle, and her fingers and toes were stiff, cold, and aching. Tears she hadn't realized she had shed coated her cheeks, mingling with the pellets of ice. Danny was alone. Worse, she had no one left to run to. Her stomach rumbled, but she had no way of accessing the last of their food. Daw's backpack was wedged underneath his body, and there was no moving it, nor accessing the zipper. And even as her stomach rumbled, Danny felt too scared to do much about it. In the end, she had kissed Daw on his cheek and stumbled away. Not back to the forest, but slowly in the growing gloom towards the buildings she saw in the far distance. Her feet and legs automatically moving, one step, then another, away from Daw, toward the unknown. By the time she reached the first of the homes, her coat was coated with ice. Her limbs felt stiff, unwieldy, and she kept falling. The first house was a burned-out ruin. So was the second, and the third, and after the fourth one she lost count. It seemed that most were burned, but others were simply dark, empty things, their doors gone, their contents removed, whoever had lived and loved and laughed inside of them long gone. She wandered up and down the streets, past burned hulks of cars, and skirted the edges of roads. The house wasn't big, or even much different from the others she had seen walking in, but Danny was drawn to it. It had signs of occupancy. The large yard in front had been cultivated. Not now, of course, but Danny could see the remnants of orderly rows that had once held plants. The rest of the houses on the block were either in ruins or obviously empty, but this house, someone lived here. The smoke curled from the chimney, and one of the windows allowed for a small glow from the fireplace within. By now, the darkness of night was complete, and Danny was afraid. What if the bad men were here? What if they wanted to hurt her? She was tired, though, so tired, and the front stoop she found herself standing in was well protected from the wind. The snow, piled high just a few feet away, actually seemed to insulate the entryway, and Danny slid down in place against the front door, seeking warmth, but also trying to marshal her reserves. Every part of her ached with exhaustion, grief, and her eyelids felt like heavy doors that would not stay open. Outside in the open, the wind howled its own grief, and she cried with it, tears leaking down her cheeks in the darkness. Somehow, despite the cold and the hunger and her grief, Danny slid into a restless sleep. The day dawned bright and light. The storm had moved on, the clouds pushed away in the wind the night before, and the sky was clear and blue. A boy had appeared at the door. The inside door, that is, whereas Danny was against the outside door, huddled in tight. He had talked to her, but Danny had been so tired, so cold and scared by then that she had no words for him. No words at all to encompass this yawning chasm of loss. It had hit her then that Daw was gone, and Mama was gone, and everyone she knew and loved, who knew and loved her back, were gone. She had ignored the boy, turned away, and cried. Perhaps she should have stayed with Daw, back at the stream. Just as she was considering going back there, if she could even find it, a woman appeared at the front of the house. She was pretty. Her long blonde hair hung out over her coat, and she had the prettiest blue eyes that Danny had ever seen. She didn't say a word, just reached down and picked Danny up, her arms warm and strong. The outer door had swung open then. The boy inside wasn't the only one there, and Danny ducked her head against the woman, tucking in close, suddenly terrified by all the strange faces. There was a tall boy, almost a man, and the boy she had already seen, and even a girl not much older than Danny. They stared at her curiously, and Danny, suddenly surrounded by warmth, began to shiver uncontrollably. The tears started up again as well. The next few hours were a blur of being bathed, new clothes, and a hot meal. No matter where she went in the house, Danny saw no evidence of the bad men. The voices weren't the same, and these people were kind. Still, Danny could not seem to make her lips work. No words escaped. She didn't have anything to say, nothing that could compare to the howling loss she felt. The little girl pressed a doll into her arms, and Danny thought of her bear, her lovey, as Mama had called it, still stuffed in her backpack, which lay abandoned by the stream. The food in her belly was more than she'd eaten in a long time. She sat there, propped up in the chair, 2 books wedged under her to raise her to the height of the kitchen table, and despite the staring eyes, found her eyes slipping closed. She barely noticed when warm, strong arms picked her up, carried her into a room, and tucked her in.
"It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now."
The man's voice was kind, reassuring. As she slid deeper into sleep, Danny let go of her fear. The bad men weren't here, and instead, this family was kind. She missed Da, just as she missed Mama and her aunties and Grandma. Here she was safe, and she liked her new name. The woman had called her Erin. Da had a sister named Erin, back in Ireland. Maybe someday she would tell her new family about Da and Mama, the aunties and Grandma. Perhaps she would tell them about the farm that her great-uncle Jamie had in Alaska, or what she and Da had seen and heard outside of town. But for now, she didn't need to talk, and she really didn't particularly want to. She just wanted to sleep in a warm place, eat good food, and not be afraid anymore. And as the winter snows fell, melted, and gave way to the sunny days of spring, Danny became Erin, a quiet, peaceful child who said nothing aloud, but made herself perfectly understood nonetheless.
Jonathan. At a ramshackle house north of town, Farley met with Wingo. They hadn't had any contact in months, not after Farley had decided that the trade in flesh was simply too dangerous as the Reformation began to solidify. The world was going back to what it had been, or at the very least, it was returning to a shadow of its former self. Alaska and Hawaii had declared their independence. So had Texas, California, Oregon, and Washington. The states that remained, however, were quickly rebuilding, and the new capital of the country would be located in North Carolina. Wingo leaned back in his chair, poked at the charred remains of a fire in the fireplace.
"I hear they found the body."
Farley nodded.
"Yes. Thurman Banks found it last week."
Wingo said nothing for a moment, then turned to stare at Farley. His direct gaze, unblinking, made Jonathan Farley more nervous than he had been when word came through the town of the little girl's discovery a few days after the incident. He broke eye contact, stared out the grimy window with its broken panes. Somewhere out there, Wingo had buried the body of C.C. Baker. Why he hadn't felt it necessary to bury the traveler, Farley had not a whit of an idea, especially now that Wingo had called this meeting.
And the child survived.
He forced himself to turn back to Wingo.
"She's a mute. Hasn't said a word since she showed up on their front stoop right after that storm." "Mute, huh? I sent one of the men over to check it out after I'd heard she'd shown up." "Not you?" Wingo's eyebrows raised. "Or young James?" Farley felt a flash of discomfort. He had thought about it, sure, but she'd seen him. What if she remembered something, freaked out, or reacted in a way that caused questions? "Kid that young. She'll forget, given enough time. She won't remember what it was like anywhere else in a year or two, and Jess and her family are rarely in town with all of the kids." He kept his face as serene as he could manage. "Didn't have time to. There were other things to attend to at the time. Didn't see a reason to follow up once I heard she was mute." Wingo stared at him silently. "Look, the kid is no danger to us. Jess Aronson says she's young, barely 3 years old. Kids don't remember stuff that happens when they are that young. If you had kids, you'd know that." "I have kids. Grown now, but I'm aware. Still, something traumatic like that, seeing her daddy killed, that's got to stick in there," Wingo said, leaning back even further in his chair. Farley gazed at the chair. One of the legs was split. Maybe it would break if Wingo leaned back far enough. It sure as hell would if he sat in it, but he was nearly 3 bills to Wingo's lean frame. "Yeah, well, why don't you go and see her for yourself?" Farley snapped, adopting a facade of false bravado. About the last thing in the world he wanted to do was go anywhere near Jess Aronson's place and risk getting fingered by the girl. But he also had no interest in having a little girl killed, so he'd made his peace with it and figured it was worth the risk. As winter had slid into spring and there had been no rumors or accusations, he'd breathed easier. Trust Wingo to dig it all up. "Maybe I will," Wingo responded, his tone cool, coated in steel. "Well, You do that.
Farley snapped, wishing, as he had done all the rest of the winter and spring, that he had never had anything to do with James Wingo in the first place.
If there isn't anything else, I'll be going. I have a town to run.
He turned and headed for the door. His heavy frame caused the rotting wood underneath to groan loudly, bowing beneath the weight. The damn place was falling apart. As his foot crossed the threshold down to the step below, he could hear Wingo speak. What he said was low, deliberate, and insidious.
There will come a time of reckoning, Farley. It might be tomorrow, next month, or in 5 years. But these things have a price. Eventually, the bill will come due.
Jonathan Farley said nothing in return as he walked away. He said nothing to his son, other than instructing him to stay away from Wingo, and he felt a wash of relief a few months later when Wingo was shot in some deal gone wrong.
A child that small, she won't remember. Who would expect her to?
He thought to himself. Nevertheless, he gave Jess Aronson's small family a wide berth in the months and years that followed.